Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's session of Food Literacy for All. Thanks for being graceful. Our speaker, Rowan White, unfortunately fell ill and was not able to join us today, but we're so lucky to have Shiloh Maples, who will be stepping up and also speaking about seed sovereignty. Again, Food Literacy for All is co-led by Dr. Bénédicte Boisseron, professor and chair of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and Shiloh Maples, tonight's speaker, community organizer, seed keeper, and storyteller. The community partners that make Food Literacy for All possible include Jerry Ann Hebron from the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, Winona Bynum from Detroit Food Policy Council, and Shakara Tyler from Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network. More team members that make this course possible include Sammy Maldonado, the Food Literacy for All course coordinator, Sai Sharuvu, Sustainable Food Systems coordinator, Dr. Leslie Hui, Sustainable Food Systems Initiative Advisory Committee, Chris Taylor, he's here with us tonight helping out with all things technology, and Tiffany Harris, our Food Literacy for All grader. Food Literacy for All is presented by the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative with generous support from the Center for the Education of Women, Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, the School for Environment and Sustainability, and the program In the Environment. To engage more with the community and the course, you can find us on X and Instagram. Of course, we have our iClicker questions QR code here. If you're not already signed up with us, go ahead and scan that real quick. As well, all of our classes are recorded and available on the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative website. Here we have our student response video for this week. Jacob H., Masters of Science in Engineering and Computer Science and Engineering student.
The concept of seed songs in Rowan White's article deeply resonated with me. She describes these as intergenerational memories carried in the, quote, blood and bones of our reciprocal relationships with our food and seed plant relatives, end quote. This isn't just about preserving seeds, it's about preserving stories, culture, and identity. What struck me most was the devastating account of the Sullivan Expedition in 1779, where American forces deliberately destroyed Haudenosaunee cornfields and food caches. Yet despite this attempt to destroy their food sovereignty, the seeds and their stories survived. This resilience is remarkable, and as White puts it, quote, when our seeds are strong, this means our nations and communities and people are strong and in good health. This article made me reflect on how we view seeds today. Many of us see them as commodities, but for indigenous communities, they're relatives with their own stories and teachings. White's description of seeds as, quote, wise elders who have been her teachers offers a profound perspective on our relationship with food and nature. This isn't just history, it's a living movement, and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is actively working to reconnect communities with their ancestral seeds, showing how traditional agricultural knowledge remains vital for our future. The concept of seed songs in
All right, before we move into our
concept
poll question, I just wanted to say that the video submissions this week were fantastic. It was so difficult to choose one. And thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. I'm excited to continue engaging with those throughout the semester. We'll move now into iClicker. So I'm starting the poll here. Okay. So question 1. And again, we're just kind of testing your knowledge. This content was going to come from Rowan's talk, but here we're just going to see what you already know, and we'll use that to gauge what we learned through the quiz responses and everything like that. What percentage of the world's critical biodiversity is safeguarded by Indigenous communities? Is it A, 50%, B, 30%, C, 80%, or D, 15%? For community members, you might be a little confused. What is iClicker? Don't worry about it. It's just for students participating in the course for a grade. You'll engage with this question through the polling feature on Zoom. We have 50% of, 17% of the class said 50% A, 21% of the class thought 30%, 50% of the class thought that 80% of the world's critical biodiversity is safeguarded by Indigenous communities. and 13% of the class said 15. The correct answer is 80%. 80% of the world's critical biodiversity is safeguarded by indigenous communities. All right, moving into question number 2. What is the concept of in situ seed banking? Is it A, seeds are kept in cold storage vaults far away from communities of origin? B, seed collections are kept in their natural evolutionary environment. Sorry, B. C, seed collections, which are preserved inside museums and university herbariums. Or D, seeds are grown and distributed by seed companies. All right, we are pretty much there. So we have 11% of the class saying A, seeds are kept in cold storage vaults far away from communities of origin. 76% of the class is saying B, seed collections are kept in their natural evolutionary environment. 10% says C, seed collections are preserved inside museums and herbariums. And 2% are saying D, seeds are grown and distributed by seed companies. Nice work, everyone. The correct answer is B. In situ seed banking means that seed collections are kept in their natural evolutionary environment. So with that, I'll pass it on to our wonderful speaker for the evening, Shiloh Maples. On to you, Shiloh.
Thank you, Taylor. Uju Bibunanonkwe, Minwa Shiloh Maples Indigenicas, Mikanakandotum, Anishinaabe Ojibwe Odawa and Dow, Anishinaabe Aki and Donjiba. Hi everyone, my name is Shiloh Maples. My Anishinaabe name is Bibunanonkwe, which means last winter's or last year's woman. I'm Turtle Clan. I'm Anishinaabe, specifically Ojibwe and Odawa. I'm a citizen of Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. I also am a descendant of the Ojibwe people of Swan Creek and Black River. And I was born and raised here in Anishinaabe territory in my ancestral homeland. I'm really sorry that Rowan is unable to join us this evening. I was really looking forward to hearing her speak, but I'm really glad also to have an opportunity this evening to share a bit about the role that food and seed play in healing and transforming Indigenous communities. I want to give a special thank you to the rest of the Food Literacy for All team who always take such care to create these spaces so that we can come into community with one another. Today, I introduced myself in a particular way, in a way that my elders and my teachers have taught me. And when I did this, I shared who I am. My clan, Turtle Clan, tells you who I have kinship ties to and about my responsibilities to all of my relations. My introduction tells you which Indigenous nations I belong to, Ojibwe and Odawa. And I introduced myself in this way because it reminds me of who I carry with me, who my work is for, and who I'm accountable. And it reminds me of my ancestors who really are the foundation of my existence and my work, and it calls them into being with me. And this introduction also positions me in relation to this place that I call home. It grounds me in all those relationships and what it means to be a person of the Great Lakes. Like many Indigenous cultures, Anishinaabe history and stories are passed down in an oral tradition. In sacred stories passed down from my Anishinaabe elders, it's said that the first human was put down on earth where the fresh and saltwater meet, in what is now known as the St. Lawrence Seaway. And in the beginning, our ancestors lived there on the East Coast. That is, until a set of prophecies came to our people, and among them it was foretold of newcomers and the destruction that would follow. And it was said that our people would be destroyed if we did not move westward. These ancestors were told to follow the path of a particular shell and trace the waterways until they found food that grows on the water. So that's what they did. They migrated westward until they reached the Great Lakes, where they found our sacred monomen, or wild rice, the food that grows on the water. And all along the Great Lakes, various small groups broke off to establish settlements and places that we consider our permanent home and the place that we're responsible for caring for. I tell this story first because my ancestors' story is part of my own. So it's important to me that I start by acknowledging them and their journey. I also share this because it illustrates how, as Indigenous people, our identities, histories, spirituality, traditions are inseparable from our respective ancestral territories. The very fabric of who we are is defined by our relationships to the inhabitants of those territories, all of those plants, animals, and humans that we live in relationship with. And as an Anishinaabe person, when I look out over the landscape of my homeland across the Great Lakes region, I see all of these human and other than human relatives that I'm connected to. And my sense of identity is deeply rooted in those relationships. And this relational worldview shapes how I see my role and purpose. As Indigenous people, our cultural teachings are what's sometimes referred to as original instructions, telling us what it means to be a good human. And as people of an oral tradition, these cultural teachings are often passed down through storytelling. So, whether an old sacred story or a more contemporary narrative, the wisdom of our ancestors guides our daily lives, reminding us why we live in a particular way. These stories remind us how we, as people of a particular place, live sustainably and maintain good relationships in that place. And from this perspective, practicing our place based foodways goes beyond basic sustenance. Our practices affirm and renew relationships, nourish our hearts, and are part of how we uphold our responsibilities to our relatives. So, whether we are a seed keeper, a farmer, a forager, a home cook, practicing and preserving our foodways makes us historians and cultural memory keepers, passing on the stories of how our peoples and our more than human kin have evolved through millennia together on the shared landmass. Every time we learn a new recipe, plant a seed, feast together, we're helping to transmit knowledge, technologies, and skills from one generation to the next, just as others did for us. And as we retrace our ancestors' foodways, we also reclaim their languages, their ceremonies, and their knowledge. We know that food does not exist separately from culture, history, or place. But the long history of colonization has had a debilitating impact on Turtle Island or North America's indigenous peoples. Many don't realize that from the very beginning of colonization, food has been weaponized against indigenous people on this continent. During the American Revolution, scorched earth policies instructed armies and settlers to burn orchards and entire fields of crops and slaughter herds of animals to starve out indigenous peoples. Forcing people from their land and waters resulted in a loss of traditional foodways and economies. Targeting food production is a tactic that colonizers have historically used to erase cultures and create manufactured dependencies where there was once sovereignty and self sufficiency. In other words, these scorched earth tactics forcibly turn people from producers into consumers and coerce them into compliance. During the treaty era, treaties were made between indigenous nations and colonial powers so that Europeans could obtain land. The hundreds of various treaties outlined the conditions under which land was exchanged and each party's responsibilities. The indigenous nations, in many cases, ceded the land, and various promises were made in exchange. So, including sometimes those promises included retaining hunting and fishing rights, food, and other resources for our communities. However, inequalities were baked into this treaty making process from the start. Indigenous communities with oral traditions and a relational worldview, I don't think could really anticipate the colonial notions of land title or resource extraction that occurred. And even if the terms of the treaties had been honored, colonial legal authorities decided any conflict or question about the treaty's terms. The colonists' deliberate refusal to understand indigenous worldviews resulted in erasure of indigenous rights without technically violating the letter of the treaties. Then, almost all of the treaties were eventually broken anyhow. From the Indian Removal Act to the establishment of reservations, federal Indian policy has repeatedly removed Indigenous people from their ancestral homelands and restricted access to hunting, fishing, and foraging lands of previous generations. This physical and spiritual displacement also meant a tremendous loss of traditional knowledge and wellness practices specific to a particular locale. During these forced relocations, the US government often passed food ration or US government often issued food rations such as lard, sugar, coffee, wheat flour, which are not a part of indigenous people's diets and lacked essential nutrients. And although there are many different accounts of its origin, it's said that fry bread first came out of this era. Today, fry bread is a controversial food amongst Native peoples. Over time and out of necessity, it became a staple dish among many Native communities, sometimes representing the comforts of home and family, and sometimes resilience and resistance. But for others, it represents a painful loss of traditional foods and is seen as a weapon of mass destruction because of its devastating impacts on our health for generations. Our traditional practices as Indigenous people were criminalized and people faced prosecution for generations. So the social policies that shaped the United States forced Indigenous people to assimilate into settler society and impose systems of private land ownership, a concept completely antithetical to Indigenous people, as in many of our traditions, we see ourselves as stewards and believe that no one can own the land. When tribes reserved the rights and treaties to hunt, fish, and gather on the land, this wasn't done as an exercise of dominion over property, though. Really, this was what they were doing was reserving these rights to maintain their relationships with plants, fish, four-legged creatures, all those more or other than human relatives. And these agreements secured these relationships and life-sustaining gifts, not just for the current generation, but for our descendants as well. Here on Turtle Island, also known as North America, Indigenous people have endured over 500 years of genocide, disenfranchisement, and oppression. Indigenous communities have been systematically stripped of their autonomy, knowledge, skills, and social systems that once enabled healthy living. And policies determining where and how Indigenous peoples could live were made with neither consultation nor representation from those communities. And this has resulted in a social environment and food system surrounding Indigenous people that's not inclusive of our worldview, and it actively undermines our well-being. And the full list of policies, systems, and institutions that have marginalized Indigenous people is too numerous to name and discuss here, but they are an integral part of the larger story. And I don't share this history to cast blame or to wallow in despair, but I really firmly believe that we must know where we have been to understand how we've gotten here. And there must be a more common understanding before we can move forward. Each of us who considers the Great Lakes our home has a responsibility to know the history of this place. And I don't think we can claim to share an honest story of this land or our food without including Indigenous people's experiences. This is a critical understanding of this journey that led us here really needs to become a more common understanding before our society can give life to a new, more equitable food system. Indigenous people and other communities of color are sometimes called historically underserved, yet history has not done this. White supremacy and capitalism have worked hand in hand through policy to build the society and the current food system. These tools of colonization have transformed Mother Earth and our other than human relatives into commodities for wealth extraction and accumulation of privilege for a few. This accumulation of wealth has only been possible through the genocide of indigenous peoples, the expropriation or government seizure of indigenous lands, the exploitation of BIPOC people and their labor. And all these have disrupted place-based cultures, practices, and physical spaces that are inherent to indigenous nationhood. Indigenous peoples were never meant to survive within these systems unless we give up who we are. And although most would be more comfortable believing that colonization has ended in the United States and globally, we know that this is still happening today in similar forms of violence. Indigenous people around the globe, along with many other communities and diasporas, bear the weight of environmental injustices, climate change, land grabbing, displacement, and food apartheid. Our communities and bodies tell this history in the devastating rates of chronic illness and intergenerational poverty. And I know these stories because my story is among them. When I introduce myself today as my elders have taught me, I'm telling you that the history of this place is part of my personal history as an Indigenous person. What it doesn't tell you is that because of this history, I'm the first generation on my maternal side in over a century to be raised by their parents. So my mom's generation, my grandma, and my great grandparents' generations were all raised outside of our cultural communities because of the social policies and acts of the US government. A seed is so small, yet they contain so much. In following the seeds, I have come to understand more about myself, my ancestors, and this place that I consider to be my homeland. And as an Anishinaabe woman, I've come from a long lineage of people who have been connected, very closely connected with food and farming because of our ancestral cosmologies and traditions. And with the help of my seed mentors and the seeds themselves, I was the first in my family in many generations to return to growing and eating these sacred foods. And in doing so, this has reconnected me with the rhythms of the natural world and grounded me in the unique qualities of this particular place. I've learned our plants and recipes, and they tasted like home. And similar to how wild rice led my Anishinaabe ancestors to our collective home, our traditional foods have guided this lifelong journey and process of coming home to myself. This journey has led me to my work as a community organizer and seed keeper in the Indigenous food sovereignty movement, where I've worked alongside Indigenous communities, my relatives, for more than a decade. And this personal story is much larger and more complex, but what I hope you take away from it is that for most of us, or many of us in the Indigenous food sovereignty movement, this is a labor of love to rebuild our communities and resist the ways that colonialism continues to manifest in the current food system. Many don't know that the root of the word economy comes from two Greek words meaning household and to manage. In essence, it emphasizes the care or management of home resources. A capitalist economy and food system is antithetical to this, though, because sooner or later it destroys the ecos, the home, in the name of profit. In some of the oldest stories from this continent, we hear cautionary tales of what's sometimes referred to as Wendigo, a monstrous being that consumes and that is never satisfied. It leaves a path of destruction as it scours the earth, devouring all, including its own. Our human economy has become a manifestation of Wendigo. As we have allowed extraction and overconsumption to run rampant, we have forgotten what it means to be human and our responsibilities as good stewards. And instead of relying on and replicating the existing food system, which commodifies and exploits the sacred, many in the indigenous food sovereignty movement are revitalizing what some refer to as a kin-centric food system. The idea of a kin-centric food system stems from the term kin-centric ecology, which indigenous scholar Enrique Salomon coined. Although the term kin-centric ecology is relatively new, it describes the relational worldview held by indigenous people around the globe since time immemorial. This worldview has no separation between natural world and humans. And as Mr. Solomon writes, we are all part of an extended ecological family that shares ancestry and origins. Within this family, humans are affected by, and in return, affect all life around them. Without human recognition of their role in the complexities of life in a place, the life suffers and loses sustainability. The human economy and food system are living systems, and if they're going to become more sustainable, then they need to be governed by natural law and embedded within ecosystems. Much of the work happening in indigenous communities is about unlearning colonial paradigms and returning to our place in the greater circle. That means rekindling those spiritual relationships, remembering our cultural teachings, and upholding sacred responsibilities as good stewards. And as we do this, we're faced with some important questions. Questions such as, what does an alternative regenerative economy look like? How can we bring our traditional gift economies back into practice? How can our relationship to land, food, and seed be different? How do we redefine or reimagine our ideas of wealth? And how can we ensure a deep sense of nourishment for all of our communities? So much important work has been done, and essential conversations are being had to ensure food security within Indigenous communities. Being confident that you can receive the nutrients you need each day is necessary to survive, and increasing food access is one goal in many Indigenous communities' food sovereignty work. However, food access in itself does not ensure that we can eat our traditional, culturally significant foods. When we are denied the right to eat, cook, and harvest our own foods, we lose the skills and knowledge of how to live sustainably within our homelands. We literally lose the capacity to feed ourselves. And when that happens, we're not able to practice and pass along the teachings that have sustained and nourished generations. And when we're neither allowed nor able to maintain our traditional food ways, we're not just losing food, we're losing culture, and the world is losing knowledge of how to live in a particular place. If Indigenous people have to give up part of their identity to have their fundamental human rights honored in the current food system, then this food system isn't for them. And that is why I work and stand firmly within the Indigenous food sovereignty movement, because this is the only food movement that is dedicated to fighting for Indigenous people's full human rights, including the inherent right to maintain our traditional food systems on our own terms. The Indigenous food sovereignty movement recognizes that the preservation and revitalization of culture are essential to long-term and holistic wellness of our communities. And this is a movement that allows our communities to not only survive, but thrive. And in that respect, other food movements simply fall short for me. And that's not to say that the work of other food movements isn't important. Food as resistance and as healing can take many forms. But I know deep in my bones that any of those other food movements alone will not liberate my family or my community from the systems or structures that are literally killing them. A more equitable food system requires narrative equity. People must get to define their own relationship to land and food and tell the stories of their work themselves. However, many of the stories about Indigenous people that exist both in the media and in people's minds are full of falsehoods and have been constructed by people outside of our cultures. This means that generations of Indigenous people, like me, first experience our own histories elsewhere through someone else's interpretation. And that's if our people are even mentioned at all. Furthermore, Indigenous communities are often invisible to the larger society or are spoken of in the past tense as if we're extinct. This invisibility harms our peoples and our nations as it often reduces us to stereotypes. It creates false notions of pan Indianism and attempts to erase our contributions to the world. And we can see this attempted erasure through our foods and seeds as well. Intellectual property rights have allowed for the privatization of Indigenous knowledge and biopiracy or theft of plant varieties that Indigenous communities have cultivated over thousands of years. The patenting of our foods and seeds is not only a serious threat to our ability to feed ourselves, but to our very identities as well. Commonly used terms such as Indian corn seem innocuous, but they exclude any mention of communities of origin. They twist our histories. They do not acknowledge our valuable contributions to agriculture or cuisine, and they perpetuate false notions that our cultural items are merely decorative. Whether through neglect or purposeful exclusion, these misappropriations continue to do damage to Indigenous communities and other communities of culture. It is true that our communities have been greatly impacted by colonization and that it continues to destabilize our food and seed systems. But despite all of colonization's best efforts, our food and seeds are living proof that we are not a conquered people. Our people have always adapted to rapidly changing social contexts and environmental conditions within our respective homelands. Our people have distilled and safeguarded thousands of years of knowledge. And Indigenous peoples have been actively stewarding and managing their respective ancestral territories as long as we've been here. This continent has never been some untouched wilderness. The North American landscape, as it was at first contact, was a direct result of Indigenous knowledge, technologies, and stewardship. It has always been and continues to be lovingly cultivated and fiercely protected. We are the descendants of a long line of resilient people who, despite so much pain and sacrifice, will continue to uphold our responsibilities as original caretakers to defend and protect our homelands. Yes, we are still here, and each time an Indigenous person tends a garden, cooks, eats their ancestral foods, I believe that's an act of resistance and an act of love. It's a reclamation of identity and a proud declaration that we will always be here. Our food and seed stories are so compelling, but are so rarely shared. And it's time that we tell our own stories for our ancestors, our communities, and our descendants. I want to take a moment to share something with you that my seed keeping mentor, actually Rowan, who was supposed to be here tonight, once shared with me. And she once said that at one time, all of our ancestors, no matter where they're from, were seed keepers. And at some point, they made a sacred agreement with the wild plants. A long time ago, humans and our wild plant relatives agreed that we would each give up some of our wildness and that we humans were going to take care of the seeds, and in return, they were going to take care of us. Since then, we have been bound in a sacred reciprocal relationship. And since each community and culture and network has its own values, seeds, and priorities when it comes to seed, there's no universal role of a seed keeper. The responsibilities will look different in terms of caring for seeds. These agreements we make with our seed relatives are the ethics that define the roles and responsibilities of a seed keeper. They're the ethics that guide our growing practices and protocols for sharing exchanging, and distributing seed. Today, the dominant worldview considers seeds to be inanimate objects whose value is limited to how much they can be bought and sold for. But before 1800, all farmers and gardeners shared, saved, traded, and swapped. There were no seed companies in the United States. And even up until the 1900s, the USDA still had free seed programs where they sent out free seed packets to disseminate the best and newest varieties. Seed was a resource meant for everyone. They were a part of the public commons. However, the rise of industrial agriculture and the commodification of food has resulted in the increasing privatization of seed. Alongside the increasing commercialization of seeds, around the turn of the century came the development of the USDA's section of seed and plant introduction, whose purpose was to, quote, bring into the country for experimental purposes any foreign seeds and plants which might give promise of increasing the value and variety of agricultural resources. Through this process, over the last 120 years or so, the US has acquired nearly 600,000 different plant accessions, or like samples, representing over 14,000 different species. In a guide from the Organic Seed Alliance, it states that today this collection is housed under what's called the National Plant Germplasm System, whose stated mission is to safeguard and utilize plant germplasm, which is genetic raw material, associated genetic and genomic databases, and bioinformatic tools to ensure an abundant, safe, and inexpensive supply of food, feed, fiber, ornamentals, industrial products for the United States and other nations. This collection is a primary source of genetic raw material for nearly all plant breeders in the United States. And this germplasm collection is managed by a computer database called Germplasm Resource Information Network, also known as GRIN. GRIN allows users to search available accessions by name, country of origin, or traits mentioned in the description. And anyone can access seeds from GRIN for free so long as they are requested for bona fide research or education purposes. According to the US National Plant Germplasm System distribution policy, seeds from GRIN can be used for a variety of trials and plant breeding projects that might result in a marketable product, but they themselves cannot be marketed or sold or used for home gardening, and they can't be just requested for individual use. And they can't be requested for any purpose that might directly compete with commercial seed producers. And through these systems, these plant relatives belonging to indigenous communities around the globe, which have been developed over thousands of years throughout traditional breeding methods, have been brought into the public domain for the advancement of colonial or Western science and have been commodified. So it's taking these plant samples, moving them into this public repository, and then anyone that's bona fide research can take that to refine into a marketable or commodifiable product. At this time, it's unclear to me whether this collection was built with the knowledge or consent of the communities of origin. That's something I'm trying to get a little bit of clarity on. But even research conducted, even research at a lot of institutions is conducted on, I guess, the backs of indigenous communities. In the Morrill Act of 1862 and the Hatch Act of 1887, the US government established the land-grant university system. Every state in the country was given thousands of acres of federally controlled land with which they could fund or endow public institutions whose designated mission would be to teach agriculture, military tactics, and mechanic arts, or what we might know as engineering today. Of course, the gift from the federal government to the states required the violent dispossession of nearly 11 million acres of indigenous land. And by educating the mostly white, mostly male students, these early institutions really helped to cement the dominance of settler colonial agricultural practices. For over a century, Western science and research have contributed to the biopiracy or theft of indigenous peoples' plant relatives and knowledge that's really core to our biocultural heritage and our sovereignty. These systems have been designed to move our relations into the public domain for research, refinement, and sale. All the while, these seeds are locked away, like legally locked away through patents from the communities from which they were taken. So expanding on this a little bit further, in 1980, the US Supreme Court ruled in a case, Diamond versus Chakrabarty, that patent protection can be used for living organisms. So patents can be applied to living organisms, including plants. Something to know about utility patents, if you're not familiar with them, is a utility patent protects an invention from being used, replicated, or sold without permission. However, when a company is granted a utility patent on a type of seed, it doesn't just own that specific seed variety, it also owns its traits. So color, texture, disease resistance, perhaps flavor profile, all they own all the rights to those, and all the rights to research how the seed can be replicated, sold, and otherwise distributed. And so this has allowed a handful of large corporations to take over the seed industry using utility patents to claim seed varieties as their own inventions. And while some argue that these patents promote innovation and encourage economic development, the global seed sovereignty movement will tell you how this inhibits small-scale breeders, seed saving, and biodiversity. I'd also add that the consolidation and restriction of seed distribution is one of the largest threats, in my opinion, to the lasting food security and the resilience of our food system. Because if someone else controls the seed, then they control your food and they control you. Seed sovereignty is the foundation of sustained food security. And many of us in this seed rematriation and seed sovereignty movement have come into this work in part because we grieve the historic and ongoing theft of our seed relatives and really fear the corporate takeovers of seeds globally. Here you can see from the diagram, I know it's very small. You don't have to worry about the details, and this is available online if you want to look it up. But here you can see from the diagram, there are about 4 or 5 multinational corporations that say that they own over 60% of the global seed supply. And they're not primarily seed companies, but rather agricultural chemical companies and pharmaceutical companies. This consolidation and control of seed distribution has created a lot of fear and confusion among small-scale breeders and seed savers, and has really inhibited public research. Because these patents claim rights over specific traits, many small-scale plant breeders are unsure of what they can and cannot use when developing new plant varieties, and they're fearful of using patent traits. Even seed savers are also concerned with accidental crossing of open pollinated varieties, or that one of their varieties may only appear to infringe on a patent. And while there are a lot of factors involved, one report found that over the last 30 years since that Supreme Court case, nearly a third of public breeding programs have shut down. The public funding that supported these types of programs has declined, which has led to reduced capacity in academic institutions and fewer people doing research, which farmers use. And this also means that universities and public institutions are losing the capacity to train future professionals whom will need to address both current and emerging challenges. Essentially, these patents lock up biodiversity that agriculturists and seed keepers have stewarded and openly shared for generations. And as fewer companies control the seed stock and breeding infrastructure, they in turn control the current and future seed supply. These restrictive patents and consolidated ownership really prevent seed saving and sharing among growers, which means that future generations will have fewer choices available to them. Furthermore, the fewer seeds in the public commons translates into less biodiversity on farms and in our gardens. And this makes our entire food system less resilient and more vulnerable to disease, pests, climate change, I'm sure a lot of other issues as well. I really believe that one of the reasons that humans have been so resilient and able to adapt to ever changing conditions is the biodiversity that we've stewarded. Our seed and plant relatives adapt really quickly. And once there were a multitude of different varieties that nourished our communities, but now there are just a handful of varieties comparatively. And every seed we fail to preserve represents a loss of that genetic diversity, possibly forever. And this diversity may hold the answer that we need to face challenges of today and tomorrow. And so I really feel like more than ever before, we need to protect the diversity and the seed commons. Over time and through numerous ways, many of us have been disconnected from our responsibilities to our seed kin. And I believe that we're being called to remember our vital relationship to both land and seed. I see so many people hunger for that relationship, that deeper relationship with land and food. And now more than ever, I think it's urgent that each of us step back onto the path of being a seed steward because it's one of the most powerful forms of activism that we have against corporate consolidation and the control of seed and food. And Tessa Peters from the Land Institute has stated that, quote, discovering a gene is not the same thing as an invention. I think we need to break down that mentality across the nation and the world. Plant breeders are not inventors. They are noticers of observable phenomena. And I'm inclined to agree with Tessa's statement. To patent a seed is to claim that you have not only invented life, but you've also have the right to control that life. And I feel like this is a really dangerous mentality to support and right to codify. And while some of these varieties may be newer, many of these seeds have been openly saved and shared by growers for thousands of years. And using their plant breeding knowledge and understanding of the local environment, agriculturists around the globe have carefully observed our plant relatives, selected and bred for certain traits, and collaborated with these plant relatives to maintain true to type varieties and co-create new varieties. Through millennia, we've cared for them. In return, they've nourished and sustained our communities. They're very much part of our communities, our families, and our shared biocultural heritage. And for many reasons, as I was saying, through different means, many people and seeds have journeyed together far from their lands of origin. Some seeds, like maize, or as the Anishinaabe may know her, mandamin, have migrated to all regions of the globe, passed lovingly from hand to hand, community to community, through trade and gifting, while others have been removed by much more violent means, through forced relocations like the Trail of Tears or the Long Walk. People would carry their seed bundles with them and sew them into the hems of their clothes for safekeeping. Before being human trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean and sold into chattel slavery, African people braided seeds into their hair. This wisdom and foresight of those ancestors is awe-inspiring. But also, many seeds and people have been disconnected from each other over time. Sometimes seeds were traded out, but they didn't stay alive in their communities of origin. And some have found themselves in places like field museums, public seed banks, private collections, and academic archives. And while some of these seed banks and archives were created in a response to erosion of biodiversity, we have to remember that these seeds are living relatives. And just like other living beings, they need to exist within a living context, within living systems. In the indigenous food sovereignty movement, as people connect with their ancestral foods, they often realize that part of this also entails reconnecting with culturally significant seed. But as I mentioned, sometimes these seeds are no longer available in their communities because of how history has unfolded. Within the indigenous food and seed sovereignty movements, there is an emerging effort to what's called rematriate seeds. And some may be familiar with the term repatriation and how it's used under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, outlines the rights and process for Native communities to reclaim ancestral remains and other sacred items that have been stolen or removed from their tribal communities. And repatriation is the process of returning those items from institutions back to their communities of origin. And in a similar way, the term rematriation and the seed rematriation movement speaks to the return of seed relatives to their home. In some indigenous communities, seed keeping is part of the part of the responsibility is carried by women. So this act of bringing them home is also about returning them to the hands of women who have spiritual responsibilities or cultural roles that can only be fully actualized when they're reunited with the seeds. But most simply, the indigenous concept of rematriation speaks to returning to our homeland and our life-giving origins. So you're probably beginning to see that when indigenous people restore their relationship to land, reclaim our culture, heal and revitalize our communities, these seeds and foods play a very important role. And in this seed rematriation work, we often advocate for communities to have seed banks where there are backups of seeds. But it's important that we remember that these seedkin are part of the ever-changing earth that we live upon. They need to be a part of our daily lives to continue to adapt and evolve. And the only way that they can do this is if we continue to grow them out season after season. If we store them away for long periods, collecting dust on a shelf, they're no longer able to respond to the ever-adapting, um, the ever-changing world around us. Seed rematriation is incredibly healing and powerful work. When indigenous communities work together in these types of cross-cultural collaborations with institutions or other entities that have been, on some level, adversaries or a threat, tremendous intergenerational healing can happen. And the seed rematriation movement has many incredible stories and messages of reconciliation and hope. And one of the biggest sources of hope for me in this work is looking across the globe at the growing movement of people who are doing tremendous work of preserving and revitalizing ancestral foodways. People like Rowan White, Akwesasne Mohawk seed keeper, who's been my seed and organizing mentor and is a generous teacher to many. Among her many splendid gifts and offerings to the food and seed sovereignty movements, Rowan's thought-provoking words provide an alternative lexicon for this work that better reflects Indigenous concepts of kinship and relational worldview. I also think about my dear sister friend, Rosebud Bear Schneider, with whom I started a food sovereignty program in Detroit many moons ago. Rosebud is an Anishinaabe farmer, the co-director of education engagement at Keep Growing Detroit, and an emerging matriarch in our Southeast Michigan community. And as one of the organizers of the Detroit Sugar Bush, she faced police harassment when officers wrongfully shut down a maple tapping gathering that the community members had already received permission to host in a city park. And following this incident, Rosebud had called upon the city to do better and advocate for changes that would allow for community members to practice their foodways in public spaces. I think about elders in this movement, like people like Clayton Brascape, a Mohawk seed keeper who currently farms with his family at the Pueblo of Tuskegee, um, New Mexico. Clayton is founding member of the Traditional Native American Farmers Association, also known as TNAFA, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to revitalize traditional agriculture for spiritual and human need by creating awareness and support for Native American environmental issues. For years, Clayton has been leading many intertribal efforts to protect traditional varieties from patenting and preserve the diversity of seeds in our community. I also think about those young elders who have taught me so much. People like Aaron Loden, an Acoma Pueblo seed keeper, who's doing really incredible intergenerational work in the Southwest, using ancestral knowledge and techniques to dryland farm during historic droughts caused by climate change. Or Kirsten Kirby Shue, a Tlingit chef and urban farmer originally from the Northwest, but who we are so lucky to have as part of our Southeast Michigan community. They're growing and cooking incredible cultural foods to increase access to that medicine for our urban Native community here, and working nationally with I Collective to bring the issue of food sovereignty to a wider audience. I also think about fellow growers and family who are doing deeply meaningful food sovereignty work in their own communities. People like Becky and Stephen Webster, Ongwakwa, 10-acre farmstead on the Oneida Reservation, where they grow traditional foods and create opportunities for the community to learn about planting, growing, harvesting, seed keeping, food preservation, food storage, as well as making traditional tools. They've established a community kitchen and trading post on site at the farm. And the trading post is a space where cash is not accepted, but that helps to facilitate community trade and bartering. They also have been key players in establishing corn and bean cooperatives alongside other growers in their community. And their philosophy is that every time an Indigenous person plants a seed, that's an act of resistance and assertion of sovereignty. And these are just a handful of the people calling for the return of traditional foodways and actively working intertribally and across movements to revitalize our traditional food systems. As a movement, we're resisting the overconsumption, extraction, exploitation, industrialization, and other ways that colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy manifest in the current food system. And in saying this, I also recognize that Indigenous people's struggles and resistance here on Turtle Island do not exist in a vacuum. Our struggles are interconnected with yours, and we have never been in this work alone. We are but one part of a larger ecosystem. I have just another slide, and then I'm going to actually wrap up a little bit. I had a few more, but I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. I just want to say that I'm really humbled and in awe of fellow organizers and growers, both past and present, from all cultures, spiritual paths, and traditions, who have tended the land in the least hospitable of places. The first reservations, gentrified neighborhoods, the front lines of both climate change and war zones to make up for the food that has been denied to our communities through manufactured scarcity. Their hands have ensured that our communities remain fed and connected to culture. And through human history, they have shown us that freedom has only ever been achieved through active resistance. So instead of accepting a failed system in an unjust world, these ancestors and relatives still among us have dreamed and labored toward building a new one. When we share their stories, we fight the erasure of generations before us who embodied the meaning of resilience. Those stewards who have safeguarded the knowledge and skills that we would need to live Minnow Bemadzewin, a good life. And when we share their stories, we acknowledge that we did not arrive to this place on our own. We honor those who risked everything, who continue to rise again day after day, and who renewed their commitment to their descendants, to the next generation, to us. Like I said, I had some more slides, but I'm going to go ahead and skip over them because I'd really like to have some time for questions and discussion. But I just want to thank you all for joining today and to hearing what I had to share about about the indigenous food and seed sovereignty movements here on Turtle Island. And I think now we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I think, Benedict, are you helping take questions this evening?
Before we go
Yes.
into questions, we have one more iClicker question.
Oh, yes, thank you, Taylor. I forgot about that.
Thank you so much, Shiloh. We're so lucky to have you and so lucky that you were able to share with us this evening. Shiloh is among us at the University of Michigan. Shiloh has done such incredible work, so I encourage you all to reach out and engage if you want to learn more. All right, before we move into questions, let's do this iClicker question. Again, community members, you will use the Zoom polling feature. Okay, so Shiloh went over this not long ago. There has been an increased concentration in the seed market over the last 20 years. This has now reached the point where a handful of multinational corporations control the global market. What percentage of the world's seed supply is controlled by multinational corporations? Is it A, 10%, B, 60%, C, 75%, or D, 25%? Again, we sort of plateau at around 185 on the iClicker end of things, so I'll keep an eye on that. Seeing some pretty consistent results from the student section and the community poll. Okay, so it's pretty head to head on both polls, but especially on the student poll here, we have 47% of students think B 60%, and 46% of folks think C 75%. On the community side of the poll, we see that most people think C 75%. Okay, Benedict, I will pass the baton on to you for Q&A.
Thank you. And thank you, Shiloh. Can you all hear me? Yes? Yes. Thank you, Shiloh, for this amazing talk. And I'm just not going to waste any time because we have a few questions and I just want to be able to ask you a few questions from the audience. And thank you for those who shared some questions. The first one I'm going to ask you is something that is related to what I wanted to ask you, so we can do one bird with two stones. And this one has to do with the fact that you talked about your Rowan as your mentor, your seed keeper mentor. And also Rowan had mentioned in her article that she's the first generation of actually going back to growing their own food for livelihood. And it felt like you said the same thing as well. So it feels like it's a new generation. And you talked also about the role of the ancestors. So it's very interesting to see that aspect of the intergenerational relationship. So the question, which is also mine, is from Alexis. Are you able to share how communities that have been forced to deprioritize more traditional methods of growing food and sharing knowledge about cultivation practices are helping younger generations to get back in touch with those practices today?
Yeah, it's happening a lot of different ways. Some of the work that I was doing in Detroit, we had a very, I think we took a very like holistic approach to our food sovereignty program. So we had cooking classes using our traditional foods, we had gardening workshops, we had seed keeping workshop, we had food processing, like how to make hominy out of
Mm,
the corn we were growing out of the garden. And so it was a very like holistic, everyone got to see the whole life cycle of those foods, and I think that type of approach, having all those different type of opportunities allowed for people to jump in, like, wherever it first interested them, and I noticed that usually it was the cooking class, like, that got people in, they wanted to
yeah,
sample some of the food we
yeah.
were cooking, um, but after they were there, it really spoke to them on a very deep personal way, and, they continued to connect to, our other programming, like the gardening workshops. But it varies from community to community what that looks like. Some people are, doing it through youth programs, some are in more intergenerational settings. In some communities, their tribal colleges have agricultural
Mm,
programs. So there's definitely a lot of variety, and there's a lot of communication between communities, like intertribal work as well, like where we're learning from each other, how to kind of weave both the ancestral practices and new lessons from present day
mm.
together to preserve our foods and um, all of the practices.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I have another question. You mentioned kin-centric at some point, and you explained what it was. So Margaret has a question about this. She says, is the regenerative system for raising meat, eggs, and milk be considered a kin-centric food system?
I think it could be, at least my understanding of it. Kin-centric, again, my understanding is that rather than seeing foods and animals and plants as something, a commodity to be bought
Mm,
and sold, um, it's centering the relationship. So seeing those plants, animals, so on, as someone that you have a familial connection with. And when you have that, I think when you have that family connection or even just closer relationship, you interact with your food, with animals,
mm,
with place in a very different way than if you just see it as something to be bought and sold and traded.
for sure.
Just as you would your other relatives, like, you are willing to fight for them and protect them when you
Hmm.
see them as kin or as
Yeah,
family.
very
But I
true.
I don't I think that they're regenerative and kin-centric could very much overlap. I think that they just speak to different, aspects.
Yeah. Quick question from Danny. Grin, among others, don't seem to hold the best interest of indigenous communities and efforts to reconnect with seed elders. Are there any hesitations to working within colonial frameworks to protect indigenous seed work and or patenting them?
Certainly, and that's,
Yeah,
where I find myself in a lot of my work outside of the classroom
yeah.
is, um, being in that in-between role, helping tribal community partners navigate, these relationships, sometimes as a consultant and mediator, facilitator, sometimes in those conversations. And some of my past work, and many of the work that other folks in this rematriation movement are building out resources and trainings
Hmm.
to better equip our communities for navigating these intercultural collaborations and partnerships. Um, but yeah, there's a lot to consider there. A lot of challenges. Just even going back to the last question, even just I'll say simple difference in worldview, but it's actually quite large. Um,
Yeah.
influences how um, different institutions or parties might approach those conversations. And so there's a lot of relationship building and trust building and
Mm.
communication. Um, and um, a lot of being like drafting really clear agreements in your working
Mm.
relationships with each other, and working at the pace of trust, in those type of partnerships. But there's a lot to consider.
Yes, I know it was not to end with such a question was not easy because it's not there is no simple answer. And I like what you said about the pace and trust as well. It's very important. I wish I could ask more questions, but I think we are out of time right now. And Sammy has one more things to share with the community, so I will have to pass it on to Sammy. But I know there was one question about book recommendations, particularly for when you teach and for K-12 students, or something that maybe Paula, you can reach out directly to Shiloh, and maybe Shiloh could share some of those recommendations even for the entire community. I think everybody would be interested in that. So
Certainly.
thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Shiloh.
Thank you, Shiloh, for that amazing talk. I just have a few final class announcements. The first one is about the Mathi Botanical Gardens and their summer internships. The application is due March 2nd if you're interested in working on their campus farm or in education, and the different internships they have available. So definitely recommend checking that out. You can learn more on the Canvas discussion page. There's a direct link. And then an exciting update for the talk on March 18th with Austin Frerick. This session has moved from being virtual to hybrid. So Austin Frerick will be speaking in the Dana Building, room 1040 on campus. A majority of the seats will be reserved for food literacy for all students, and there will also be seats reserved for community members and the public on a first come, first served basis. We expect to have plenty of seats. This talk will be available on Zoom live stream and recorded as well, though we highly encourage you to join us in person if you will be on campus. And lastly, for next week on February 11th, we'll be hearing from Catherine Miller. Catherine Miller is the author of At the Table, The Chef's Guide to Advocacy, and she will be speaking on the power of local food systems, how chefs, farmers, and advocates are rebuilding America's food economy. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again, Shiloh Maples, for an amazing talk on Seeds of Sovereignty. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next Food Literacy for All sessions. Thank you.